"You are too fat to be my wife." Daniel Hayes said those 8 words into a live microphone in front of 200 people, while Emily stood 5 feet away in her wedding dress. Then he laughed. Not nervously, not apologetically. He actually laughed, adjusted his tie, and raised his champagne glass like he had just told a clever joke. 200 people watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody walked across that ballroom to stand beside her. Emily did not scream. She did not collapse. She set her glass down, walked out alone, and sat on the cold concrete outside until a black car stopped and the most feared man in Chicago stepped out and said 4 words that changed everything. If you've ever been humiliated by someone you trusted completely, stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Because what happens next will change the way you see love forever. Emily Carter had spent 11 months planning the perfect engagement party. 11 months choosing the right venue, the right flowers, the right dress. 11 months imagining the moment Daniel would stand in front of everyone they knew and say out loud that she was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. She had replayed that moment in her head so many times that it had started to feel like a memory instead of a dream. The Grand Ellington Hotel, crystal chandeliers, 200 people who mattered to them. A night that was supposed to mark the beginning of everything. She wore white because Daniel told her white was elegant. She wore her hair up because Daniel said it made her look more refined. She had spent 3 hours getting ready, studying herself in the mirror, telling herself that tonight was different. Tonight, all the quiet criticisms and carefully worded suggestions would stop. Tonight, he was going to choose her. Publicly. Permanently. She arrived early because she wanted to see his face when he walked in. She wanted that moment, the moment he saw her across the room and smiled the way he used to smile in the beginning before the comments started. Before the "have you thought about cutting carbs" and the "I just want you to be healthy" and the long, pointed silences whenever she ordered dessert at dinner. But Daniel was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the bar with 2 of his friends laughing at something she hadn't heard, and when he turned and saw her walking toward him, his expression didn't do what she hoped it would do. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they've been avoiding. "You look nice," he said. Not beautiful, not stunning, nice. Emily smiled and told herself she was being too sensitive. The party filled quickly. People she had known for years arrived in small clusters, filling the ballroom with noise and warmth. Emily moved through the room, greeting people, accepting hugs, smiling at compliments. For a while, she let herself believe in the version of the night she had built inside her head. She laughed with Daniel's mother. She danced briefly with her college roommate. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at the lights reflecting off the chandeliers and thought, "This is real. This is my life. This is the beginning." Then Daniel picked up the microphone. She saw him move toward the small, raised platform near the center of the room. She assumed it was time for the toast. She assumed he would say the things she had been waiting to hear. Her heart started moving faster. She smoothed the front of her dress and stood a little straighter because in about 60 seconds, Daniel Hayes was going to tell 200 people that he wanted to marry her, and she wanted to be standing exactly right when it happened. He cleared his throat. The room quieted. Everyone turned toward him with warm, expectant faces. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he said. His voice was steady, almost too steady. "And I want to be honest with you all because I think honesty is the foundation of everything." Emily felt something shift in the air. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," Daniel continued, "about what I want, about what I need, about the kind of partnership I'm looking for in a marriage." He paused. "And the truth is, I can't stand at an altar and commit my life to someone who doesn't respect herself enough to take care of her own body." The room didn't react immediately. There was a half-second of confused silence, the kind that happens when something is so unexpected that the brain needs a moment to process it. And then Emily understood. He was talking about her. He was standing at a microphone in front of 200 people, and he was talking about her body, in front of her college roommate and his mother and her co-workers and people she had known since childhood. In front of everyone. "I need a woman who takes care of herself," he said. "I need a partner who makes health a priority. And I realize now that I've been waiting for that to change, and it hasn't changed, and I owe it to myself to be honest about what I need." Emily didn't move. She stood completely still in the middle of that ballroom, while 200 pairs of eyes found her and stayed there, and she did the thing she had been trained her entire life to do. In moments of unbearable pain, she kept her face very, very calm. She did not scream. She did not throw the champagne glass she was still holding. She did not say any of the words that were gathering like a storm behind her sternum. She set the glass down on the nearest table. She smoothed the front of her white dress one more time, and she walked out. Nobody followed her. She noticed that too, in the sharp and merciless way you notice things when your entire nervous system has shifted into a kind of emergency stillness. She walked past Daniel's mother, who looked at the floor. She walked past her college roommate, who opened her mouth and then closed it again. She walked past Daniel himself, who didn't look at her at all. 200 people watched her leave, and not one of them moved. The September air outside the Grand Ellington Hotel hit her like something physical. She stood on the sidewalk in her white dress and her elegant, upswept hair and her carefully chosen shoes, and for a long moment she simply stood there, breathing, staring at the row of black cars parked along the curb. Then her legs stopped working. She sat down on the concrete steps outside the hotel because there was nothing else to do, and she pressed both palms flat against her knees and she started to cry. Not the soft, controlled crying of someone who is sad. The kind of crying that tears something loose inside you. The kind that sounds wrong coming out of your own body. The kind you haven't allowed yourself in years because you've been too busy holding yourself together. She didn't know how long she sat there. She didn't hear the car door open. She didn't notice the black sedan that had pulled silently to the curb in front of her until a voice spoke from somewhere above her head. "Are you hurt?" The voice was low, calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from indifference, the kind that comes from a person who has seen worse things than a woman crying on a sidewalk and has learned not to waste energy on panic. Emily looked up. The man standing outside the open rear door of the black car was tall. Dark coat, dark eyes that caught the streetlight and held it. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately identify because it wasn't pity, and it wasn't curiosity, and it wasn't the carefully constructed blankness of someone trying not to stare. He was simply looking at her, directly, without apology or performance. "I'm not hurt," she said, which was either the most honest or the most dishonest thing she had ever said, depending on how you define the word. "You're sitting on the ground in a white dress outside a hotel," he said, "in September." "I'm aware of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My name is Damian Moretti." Emily stared at him. The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Damian Moretti. She had heard that name in newspaper headlines and whispered conversations at charity events, in the careful way people changed the subject when his business interest came up. Damian Moretti was not a man you talked about loudly in Chicago. He was the kind of man who existed in the negative space of conversations, the thing everyone knew about and no one said directly. "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know I don't waste time," he said. "Come with me." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to get off the ground." Something about the directness of it cut through the noise in her head. She stood up. Not because she trusted him. She didn't trust anyone at that particular moment, possibly ever again. But because the concrete was cold and she was tired of sitting in her humiliation on a public sidewalk. She stood up and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Marry me," he said. Emily blinked. "I'm sorry. You heard me? You cannot be serious." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago. No increase in volume, no sign that he understood how insane this was. "I have a meeting with the city council in 72 hours. I need a wife. You need to be somewhere that isn't here. Those two problems have one solution." "That's not how marriage works," Emily said. "You don't just..." "I'll give you until noon tomorrow," he said. He handed her a card, a plain card with a phone number. Nothing else. "If you call, the car will come. If you don't, I won't contact you again." He got back in the car. The car drove away. Emily stood alone on the sidewalk outside the Grand Ellington Hotel, holding a white card in one hand, wearing a white dress that had meant something 2 hours ago. And she thought about every single thing that had just happened. She thought about the way Daniel's voice had sounded in the microphone. She thought about the 200 faces that had watched her walk out. She thought about her roommate who hadn't moved. She thought about 3 years of carefully chosen words and pointed silences and the constant grinding work of trying to be smaller, quieter, easier, trying to be less of herself in every possible direction, all so that someone else could love her more comfortably. She thought about Damien Moretti, who had looked at her directly and spoken to her like she was an adult capable of making her own decisions. She went home. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed in the white dress, and she turned the card over in her hands, and she thought about what it meant to say yes to something that made no rational sense. She thought about what it meant to say yes to anything after tonight. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into the Grand Ellington Hotel 3 hours ago, full of hope, full of certainty, and the version of herself sitting here now, which felt like something that had been turned inside out. At some point in the early morning that she lay down. At some point after that, she slept. When she woke up, it was 9:15 in the morning, and the September light was coming through the curtains, and she lay still for exactly 4 minutes before the events of the previous night came back in full. She got up, she made coffee, she stood at the kitchen window and drank it and watched people moving on the street below and tried to figure out what she actually believed about her own life. Her phone had 47 notifications. Most of them were from people who had been at the party. She didn't read any of them. She could guess with reasonable accuracy what they said. Some version of, "Are you okay?" from people who had not moved when she walked out. Some version of, "I can't believe he did that," from people who had been friends with Daniel longer than they had been friends with her. Possibly something from her mother, which she was absolutely not ready for. She set the phone face down on the counter. She looked at the white card. She thought about Damien Moretti's voice, the particular quality of it, the absence of softening or performance. He had spoken to her the way someone speaks when they're not trying to manage your reaction, when they're simply telling you the truth and letting you do what you want with it. She thought about the word he had used, remarkable. He hadn't used it last night. She realized that now. He had said something else, something about needing a wife, about a problem and a solution. But the word remarkable was already in her head, and she didn't know where it had come from, and that bothered her in a way she couldn't explain. At 11:32 in the morning, she picked up the card. At 11:44, she was still holding it. At 11:47, 13 minutes before noon, 13 minutes before the deadline, she hadn't agreed to but somehow felt the weight of anyway. She dialed the number. It rang once. Yes, his voice. She opened her mouth. She thought about Daniel and the microphone. She thought about 200 people watching her walk out alone. She thought about 11 months of planning and 3 years of trying to be smaller and the particular specific agony of sitting on concrete in a white dress while nobody moved. Yes, she said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "The car will be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. Emily stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and the coffee going cold on the counter, and she thought, "I have just agreed to marry the most dangerous man in Chicago." She thought, "I am either the bravest person I know or the most broken." She thought maybe those two things are the same. She went to pack a bag. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known standing in her kitchen with her cold coffee and her 47 unread notifications, was that Damien Moretti had not chosen her last night. He had noticed her months before that. He had watched her move through crowded rooms alone, carrying herself with a particular quiet dignity that he had only ever seen in one other person in his life. He had been watching her since March. And the engagement party, Daniel's public cruelty, Emily's composed exit, the white dress on the sidewalk, had not been an accident of timing. Damien had been at that event for a different reason entirely. Emily Carter had no idea that the most dangerous man in Chicago had been paying attention to her long before she gave him a reason to stop. She had no idea what was waiting for her inside that mansion on Lake Michigan. And she had absolutely no idea that the photograph already existed. A photograph taken months ago before she knew his name, before he spoke to her on the sidewalk, before any of this, sitting in a room upstairs, in that silent house next to the belongings of a dead girl who had once been the only light in Damien Moretti's life. She picked up her bag. The car was already waiting outside. The car ride to the courthouse took 19 minutes. Emily sat in the back seat with her bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she did not say a single word. Neither did Damien. He sat beside her with his phone in one hand and his attention somewhere else entirely, and the silence between them was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are both pretending very hard that the situation they are currently in is completely normal. It was not normal. Emily knew it was not normal. She had agreed to marry a man whose last name she had only ever seen in newspaper headlines. She had packed a bomb in 20 minutes. She had not called her mother. She had not called anyone. She had simply walked out of her apartment and gotten into a black car, and now she was sitting in it, heading toward a courthouse wearing yesterday's clothes because she hadn't thought clearly enough to change. She almost said something 3 different times during those 19 minutes. She almost said, "I don't actually know anything about you." She almost said, "I need you to explain what this actually is." She almost said, "I think I may have made a serious mistake." She said none of those things because each time she opened her mouth, she thought about Daniel's voice in the microphone and the 200 people who had watched her walk out alone, and the thought of going back to any version of that life, even just returning to her apartment and sitting alone with her phone full of notifications she didn't want to read was worse than the silence in this car. So she stayed quiet, and so did he. The courthouse was a gray building downtown that smelled like old paper and institutional cleaning products. Damien had clearly arranged everything in advance because there was no waiting, no line, no explanation required. A clerk led them to a small room. 2 witnesses Emily had never seen before stood near the wall. A judge who looked like he had performed this particular service for Damien Moretti before, or at least for someone like him, stood behind a wooden desk and opened a small book. The entire ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Emily knew because she watched the clock on the wall the whole time. Not because she was bored, because she needed something concrete to look at while a stranger read words about love and commitment and lifelong partnership to 2 people who had met on a sidewalk less than 24 hours ago. When the judge said, "You may kiss the bride," Damien turned to look at her and she looked back at him, and there was a beat, a very short, very specific beat where something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Then he extended his hand. She shook it. The 2 witnesses signed the document. The judge closed his book. Emily became Emily Carter Moretti in a room that smelled like cleaning products with no flowers, no music, and no kiss. Damien's lawyer was waiting outside with a folder of paperwork. As they walked toward the car, Damien handed her the folder without looking at her and said, "This establishes your legal rights within the household: bank access, medical authority, and a monthly personal account. You don't need to ask me for money." Emily took the folder. "You prepared this before I called you," she said. "Yes." "You were confident I would say yes." He finally looked at her. "No," he said. "I was prepared for both outcomes." She didn't know what to do with that, so she got in the car. The drive to the mansion took 40 minutes, and this time the silence felt different. Not comfortable exactly, but shifted. Like 2 strangers on a long flight who have acknowledged each other's existence and established a kind of temporary truce. She looked out the window. He worked on his phone. At one point, he made a call in Italian that lasted about 6 minutes, and his voice during that call was completely different from the voice he used when he spoke to her, lower, harder, stripped of any quality that could be described as human warmth. Emily sat 2 feet away and listened to it and thought, right, this is who he actually is. The man on the sidewalk was something he chose to show her. This voice on the phone is the real version. The mansion appeared through the windshield before she was ready for it. It was enormous. That was the only word that came to her immediately. Enormous and silent, set back from the road with Lake Michigan visible behind it, the kind of building that exists to communicate a specific message about the person who owns it. The message was, "I have power and I intend to keep it." "Come on," Damien said. He was already out of the car. Inside, a woman named Rosa met them at the door. She was in her 60s, compact and efficient, with dark eyes that took Emily in with quick professional assessment. "Mrs. Moretti," she said, and the title landed on Emily like something she hadn't agreed to wear yet. "Emily," Emily said immediately. Rosa nodded once like she was filing this away. "I'll show you to your room." Damien's voice came from behind her. "I have calls to make. Dinner is at 7. Rosa will show you everything you need." Emily turned around. He was already walking away down the hallway, phone to his ear, his attention entirely elsewhere. She watched him disappear through a door at the end of the hall, and the door closed behind him, and she stood in the entrance of a mansion that was now technically her home, holding a folder of legal documents and a bag she had packed in 20 minutes, married to a man she barely knew. Rosa was watching her with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Does this happen often?" Emily asked. Rosa paused. "No," she said finally. "This has not happened before." Her room was on the east side of the house in what Damien had apparently designated as her wing. It was large and quiet and completely impersonal, the way rooms in expensive hotels are impersonal, comfortable in every practical sense, designed to accommodate a person without revealing anything about them. There was a window that looked out over the water. There was a bed with white linens. There was an empty closet that was much larger than she had any clothing to fill. She sat on the edge of the bed and put the folder on the nightstand and her bag on the floor. And she thought, okay, this is where I live now. Then she thought, what am I doing? The first week was the strangest week of Emily Carter's life, and her life had, as recently established, taken some significant turns. She and Damien shared a house of approximately 10,000 square feet and managed to occupy it in a way that felt like they were on separate continents. He was up before she was every morning. He had calls and meetings and people arriving and leaving at all hours. He moved through the house with the particular focused energy of someone who has learned to treat their home as an extension of their office, and Emily moved through it in the spaces he left behind. They had dinner together every night at 7 because apparently this was a rule. She didn't know whose rule it was or when it had been established, but Rosa set the table for 2 every evening without being asked, and Damien appeared in the dining room at exactly 7 o'clock every night, and Emily was there because she had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. The first dinner they had together, neither of them spoke for 6 full minutes. Emily counted. She was eating a piece of bread and counting silently and thinking, this is genuinely insane. Then Damien set his fork down and said, "You're not what I expected." Emily looked up. "What did you expect?" "More fear," he said, bluntly, without apparent awareness that this was an unusual thing to say to someone at dinner. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, which was mostly true. "Should I be?" He picked his fork back up. "Most people are." "Most people didn't just marry you on 12 hours notice," she said. "I think I've established that I have unusual risk tolerance." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one maybe. A micro movement that lasted about half a second before his face went back to its usual arrangement. It was the first moment she thought there's actually a person in there. By the third dinner they were talking. Not warmly, not easily, but talking. He asked what she did for work. She told him she had been a graphic designer for a nonprofit that focused on literacy programs for adults. He listened in the particular way that people listen when they're actually paying attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak, which was more than she had expected from him. She asked what he actually did, and he looked at her for a moment like he was deciding something. "I manage interests," he said. "That's deliberately vague." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." "Are people afraid of you because of the things you've done or because of the things they think you've done?" He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "Does that bother you?" Emily thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll tell you when I figure it out." This time, the almost smile lasted a full second. The second week, she started exploring the house. Not intrusively, she wasn't opening doors she hadn't been invited to open, but walking through the rooms that were clearly available to her, getting a sense of the physical shape of the place where she was living. There was a library on the second floor that was astonishing in its breadth, floor-to-ceiling shelves, thousands of books organized with a precision that suggested someone had spent real time with them. There was a piano in one of the sitting rooms that had a layer of dust on the keys that told her nobody had played it recently. There was a garden through the glass doors off the kitchen, and she could see from the window that it had roses that had clearly been maintained with care long past the point where whoever was caring for them had stopped. On the 14th day of her life in that house, Emily went upstairs to a part of the building she hadn't been to before, the 3rd floor. She wasn't sure what drew her there. Restlessness, maybe, or the particular brand of curiosity that lives in people who process pain by trying to understand things. The hallway on the 3rd floor was quiet in a different way than the rest of the house. The rest of the house was quiet because it was large and empty. This hallway was quiet because something had happened here that had made silence permanent. She almost turned around. She would think about that later, the moment when her instinct said, "Go back," and she didn't listen. She would think about how different everything might have been if she had just turned around. Instead, she walked to the end of the hall and opened the last door. The room inside was untouched, not in the way that unused guest rooms are untouched, in the way that someone has made a deliberate, careful decision not to touch it. Everything in it was placed with intention. A desk, a bookshelf, Photographs on the wall, a jacket hung over the back of a chair, a coffee mug sitting on the nightstand like whoever had used it had just stepped out and was coming back. They were not coming back. Emily knew that standing in the doorway. She knew without being told that this room belonged to someone who was gone and that the room had been left this way because the person who owned the house could not make himself take it apart. She almost left without looking further. Almost. Then her eyes landed on the photograph on the desk. She crossed the room slowly, picked it up, looked at it. It was a photograph of a young woman, maybe 25, laughing at something outside the frame. Dark eyes, a warmth in her face that was immediately striking the kind of warmth that comes through even in photographs, even in still images, even across whatever distance exists between the living and the dead. She set it down carefully and turned to look at the rest of the room. That was when she saw the second photograph. It was on the bookshelf, partially obscured by a small stack of paperback novels. She almost missed it. She almost walked past it. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, sliding the books aside to see it clearly. And then she stopped breathing for a moment. Because the photograph on the bookshelf was not of the young woman in the first photo. It was of Emily. Taken from a distance, at an angle, the kind of photograph someone takes without the subject knowing. She was at some kind of event, a charity function, she thought, recognizing the venue, wearing a blue dress she had bought 2 years ago. She was standing alone near the edge of the room, holding a glass, not talking to anyone. She looked at this photograph for a very long time. She turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't Damien's, too looping, too warm, too much personality in it, were 4 words: "She has the eyes." Emily set the photograph down exactly where she had found it. She walked back to the doorway. She stood there for a moment, looking at the room one more time, the jacket on the chair, the coffee mug on the nightstand, the photograph of the laughing woman on the desk. Then she went downstairs to find Damien. He was in his study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked at him, sitting behind his desk, and she said, "Whose room is on the 3rd floor?" The change that moved across his face was the most human thing she had seen from him since the sidewalk. It happened fast, a flash of something raw and unguarded, and then it was gone, locked back behind the wall. But she had seen it. "You went up there," he said. His voice was flat. The door was unlocked. He was quiet for a moment. "My sister," he said finally. "Isabella. She died 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Emily said, and she meant it. She meant it with all of herself, because she could see even now, even with him sitting behind that desk with his face arranged back into its professional stillness, that Isabella Moretti had been the kind of loss you don't recover from, the kind that just becomes part of the architecture of who you are. "There was a photograph in her room," Emily said carefully, "of me." Damien looked at her. "It was taken before we met," she said. "Before the hotel, before you stopped your car." She paused. "You need to explain that to me." For a long moment, he didn't speak. She watched him decide something. She could almost see the calculation happening, how much to say, how much to keep, what version of the truth was safe to offer, and what version might cost him something. "I noticed you," he said finally. 6 months ago, at a charity event for the Children's Hospital. You were standing alone near the back of the room. Why were you watching me?" He looked down at his desk for a moment, then back up at her. "Because you moved through a room full of people the same way Isabella did," he said, "like you were carrying something heavy that nobody else could see, and you were doing it without complaining." Emily stood in the doorway of his study and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "Isabella took the photograph," Damien said. "She saw you at 2 different events before she died. She told me you were someone worth knowing." Emily's voice came out quieter than she intended. "What did she write on the back?" Damien looked at her steadily. "She has the eyes," he said. It was something Isabella said about people she trusted, that you could tell everything about a person from whether they looked at the world with anger or with patience. He paused. "She said you had the eyes of someone who had survived things and hadn't let it make her hard." Emily held very still. "She was right," Damien said. "It wasn't a compliment exactly, it was an observation. The kind a person makes when they're reporting on something they've confirmed through their own careful attention." Emily thought about the engagement party. She thought about Daniel's voice in the microphone. She thought about 200 people watching her leave, and the cold concrete sidewalk, and the white dress, and all the months before that, all the quiet grinding work of trying to be smaller, so that someone else could love her without discomfort. She thought about a dead girl who had looked at her across a crowded room and written 4 words on the back of a photograph. She has the eyes. Why didn't you tell me this before? Emily asked. Because Damien said you needed to choose to be here, not because I convinced you of something. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I'm going to need you to tell me about Isabella. Something moved in his face again. That same flash of raw and unguarded that she had seen when she first mentioned the room. This time it didn't lock back as fast. Not tonight, he said. Casey said, but eventually. He nodded, once, like a promise he wasn't entirely sure he could keep but was making anyway. Emily turned to leave. She was almost through the door when his voice stopped her. Emily. She turned back. I didn't marry you because I pitied you, he said. His voice was completely even. I want to be clear about that. She looked at him across the study, this enormous quiet room, this man who had built walls so high around himself that grief had moved in and set up permanent residence. And she thought about the rose garden she had seen from the window, the roses maintained long past the point where anyone was tending them blooming anyway, stubborn and alive. I know, she said. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up the folder of legal documents from the nightstand and held it in both hands and thought about Isabella Moretti writing 4 words on the back of a photograph. She thought about what it meant that those words existed, that the photograph existed, that some version of this had been set in motion not by Daniel's cruelty or the hotel ballroom or the sidewalk or the black car, but months earlier, by a young woman with dark eyes who had looked across a crowded room and recognized something. Emily set the folder back on the nightstand. She lay down. For the first time in longer than she could remember, longer than the engagement, longer than Daniel, longer than all the months of quiet criticism and careful shrinking, she fell asleep without thinking about whether she was enough. She just slept. And in his study downstairs, Damien Moretti sat behind his desk in the dark for a long time after she left. Not working, not on the phone, not doing any of the things he normally did to keep himself from feeling anything. He just sat there in the dark, thinking about his sister's handwriting on the back of a photograph. Thinking about the way Emily Carter had walked into his study and asked him a direct question without flinching. Thinking about the fact that for the first time in 3 years, someone had gone upstairs to the 3rd floor and he had not felt the need to make them leave. He sat there for a long time. Then he turned off the desk lamp and went to bed. Part 3. The night her ex returned, 3 weeks after Emily moved into the mansion, Damien knocked on her bedroom door at 7 in the morning. She was already awake. She had been awake since 5, sitting at the small desk near the window with a sketchbook she had found in one of the drawers, drawing nothing in particular. Just letting her hand move across the paper the way she used to before Daniel convinced her that her creative work was a distraction from more important things. Like dieting, like being presentable, like being the kind of woman a man like him wouldn't be embarrassed to stand next to. She said, "Come in," and Damien opened the door and stood in the doorframe in a dark suit that she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in the world. Like armor he had worn for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to take it off. "I need you in Manhattan this weekend," he said. Emily set her pencil down. "Okay." He looked at her for a moment like her lack of resistance surprised him. "There's a charity gala Saturday night. Political donors, city council, some federal people. I need my wife present." "I understand," she said. "It will be complicated," he said carefully. "My world is not." He stopped, started again. "The people at these events are not always what they appear to be." "Neither are you," Emily said. "I've managed so far." That almost smile again. Half a second, gone. "Rosa will arrange whatever you need for the event," he said. "Clothing appointments, whatever you want." "I have my own clothes," Emily said. "I know," he said. "I'm not telling you what to wear. I'm telling you that if you want anything, it's available." He paused. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "There is." He nodded and left. Emily picked her pencil back up and sat for a moment thinking about the specific way he had said that "I'm not telling you what to wear," and how strange it was that such a simple statement could feel like something significant. Daniel had opinions about her clothing approximately 4 times a week. He never called them orders. He called them suggestions, preferences. Just an observation, just thinking about how you present yourself. The language of control dressed up as concern. Damien had said, "Whatever you want." She went back to her drawing. On Thursday, 2 days before the gala, Rosa appeared at her door with a garment bag and a look on her face that communicated she was delivering something she had been told to deliver and was not going to offer an opinion about it either way. "From Mr. Moretti," Rosa said. Emily unzipped the bag. Inside was a gown in deep burgundy, floor length, rich fabric that moved when she held it up, the kind of dress that was designed to fit a body as it actually existed rather than as someone else thought it should. Not hiding anything, not minimizing anything, just present, real, unapologetic. She stood there holding it for longer than she expected to. There was a card in the bag, plain. His handwriting, which she was beginning to recognize, precise, slanted slightly, left the handwriting of someone who learned it deliberately rather than naturally. It said, "Isabella would have chosen this. You don't need to wear it, but she would have chosen it." Emily read the card twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her nightstand next to the folder of legal documents she still hadn't finished reading, next to the pencil she used every morning, next to the small accumulation of things that were starting to mean something in her new life. She wore the dress. Saturday arrived with the particular pressure of an event Emily hadn't chosen but had committed to. The flight to Manhattan was 2 hours on a private plane that Damien used the way other people use taxis, without comment, without ceremony, like the extraordinary was simply ordinary when you existed at a certain level of power. Emily sat across from him and drank coffee and looked out the window and tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever walking into Damien Moretti's world at a formal event was going to require. "Tell me who I need to know," she said at some point over Pennsylvania. Damien looked up from his phone. "Why, because I'm going to be standing next to you for several hours and I'd rather not be caught off guard." He studied her for a moment. Then he put his phone down entirely, which she was learning meant he had decided something was worth his full attention. He spent the next 40 minutes telling her with specific and unsentimental precision who would be at the gala, and what they wanted and what they were afraid of, and what she should and should not say to each of them. It was like being briefed by someone who had mapped every room before walking into it, who never entered a situation without understanding its terrain completely. Emily listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions, both of which made him pause briefly before answering, which she took as the evidence that they were the right questions. When he finished, he picked his phone back up. Then he set it back down again. "You're not nervous," he said. "I'm nervous," she said. "I'm just not going to let it run me." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was getting better at reading, the particular quality of attention he gave something when it landed somewhere unexpected inside him. "My sister used to say something like that," he said. He said it quietly, like he hadn't entirely meant to say it out loud. Emily didn't push. She had learned in 3 weeks of dinners and studied doorways and careful conversations that Damien Moretti would tell her things about Isabella when he was ready to tell them, and that the way to make him ready was to not demand it. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Emily said. "She was the best person I've ever known," he said. Simply, flatly, the way you state a fact that contains more grief than any adjective can hold. Emily nodded and looked back out the window, and they flew the rest of the way to Manhattan in a silence that had changed quality warmer, somehow more honest than comfortable silences usually are. The gala was at a hotel in Midtown that made the Grand Ellington look modest. Emily walked in beside Damien and felt the shift in the room the moment people registered who he was. It was physical, almost a kind of atmospheric change, the way pressure drops before a storm. Conversations paused, eyes moved. People who had been mid-sentence with someone else tracked him across the room with the careful, peripheral attention of people who understood that Damien Moretti's presence at an event always meant something. And then those eyes found Emily, and they stayed. She felt it. Of course she felt it. The assessment, rapid and thorough, moving from her face to her body to the dress to her face again. The mental calculation happening behind polite expressions. Who is she? What is she doing here? Is she really what she appears to be? She kept her chin level. She kept her hands still. She stood next to Damien Moretti in a burgundy dress that didn't apologize for any part of her, and she thought about Isabella writing 4 words on the back of a photograph, and she thought, "I have survived worse rooms than this." Damien stayed close. Not possessively, he didn't hover, didn't manage her, didn't treat her like something that needed protection from the room. But he stayed within range, And when he introduced her, he said my wife with an authority that left no space for the follow-up questions she could see forming in people's faces. The first hour was manageable. She talked to a city councilwoman from Chicago, who was smarter and funnier than her public persona suggested. She talked to a foundation director who worked on education access, and they had a real conversation about the kind of literacy programming Emily had done at the nonprofit. And for 20 minutes, she forgot she was at a Mafia gala in Manhattan and just talked about something she actually cared about. Then Damien appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "There's someone across the room you should be aware of." She turned, following his gaze, and the floor dropped out from under her. Daniel. Daniel Hayes was standing 30 feet away in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly with a thin blonde woman on his arm who was laughing at something he'd said, and he was smiling the easy, comfortable smile of a man who had never once sat on a concrete sidewalk in a white dress wondering why no one came to stand beside him. Emily's body did something involuntary. Not visible, she had enough control for that, but internal. A kind of clenching, a preparation, the physiological equivalent of bracing for impact. Her heart rate went up. Her hands wanted to do something, but she kept them still. "How is he here?" she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "He works for a lobbying firm that represents two of the foundations sponsoring this event," Damien said. He said it neutrally, informatively, without the particular quality in his voice that would indicate whether he had known in advance. She glanced at him. His face told her nothing. "Did you know he would be here?" she asked. A pause, very brief. "I suspected." Emily looked at him. "You could have told me. You would have decided not to come. That was my choice to make." "Yes," he said. "It was, and I made a different choice." He met her eyes directly. "You can be angry at me for that." She was. For about 15 seconds, she was genuinely angry, a quick, hot flash of it, the feeling of having been managed by someone who had made a decision for her under the pretense of knowing better. She knew that feeling. She knew it very well. But then she looked at Damien's face and she saw something that Daniel's face had never once shown her. He wasn't pretending he hadn't done it. He wasn't offering a softer version of what had happened. He had made a choice he knew it was arguable, and he was standing in front of her and letting her be angry without deflecting. She took a breath. "Don't do it again," she said. "Understood," he said. Across the room, Daniel turned and saw her. She watched his face do the calculation, the same rapid assessing movement his eyes always made when they landed at her. She saw the moment he registered the dress, the room, the man standing beside her. She watched something shift in his expression, some recalibration happening behind his eyes. Then he smiled and started moving toward her, and she thought, of course he does. He cut across the room with the particular confidence of someone who has never fully understood that he might not be welcome somewhere. The blonde woman followed 2 steps behind, trying to maintain her social smile, while clearly sensing something complicated was happening. "Emily," Daniel said, warm, surprised, performing both. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Daniel," she said, nothing else. His eyes moved to Damien. Something moved through them, recognition, she thought, and under the recognition, something else. Something that looked a great deal like fear wearing the costume of arrogance. "And you must be the husband," Daniel said. He extended his hand to Damien with the smile of a man who has decided the best strategy is confidence. "Daniel Hayes, Emily and I go way back." Damien looked at the extended hand for 1 full second before he shook it. The handshake lasted exactly as long as it needed to and not a moment longer. "I know who you are," Damien said. His voice was completely even. Daniel's smile held, but something behind it shifted. "Great event," he said, pivoting. "Good cause. Emily, you look..." His eyes moved over her in the old way, the assessing way, and she felt her jaw tighten. "Well, she looks remarkable," Damien said, flatly, correcting the record without raising his voice. Daniel laughed a little too quickly. "Right, yes. Listen, it's good to see you doing well, Emily, genuinely." He turned the smile back on the one she had once believed was real. "I heard about I know the engagement didn't..." He paused, clearly, deciding which version of this was most advantageous. "I hope there are no hard feelings. What happened at the party? I said some things that..." "You said exactly what you meant," Emily said. The words came out calm, completely calm. She surprised herself with how calm they were. Daniel stopped. The smile held, but the eyes went careful. "Emily, You stood at a microphone in front of 200 people and told them I wasn't worth marrying because of my body, she said, still calm, still level. You didn't misspeak. You didn't lose your temper. You had a drink in your hand and you were smiling when you did it. So please don't stand in front of me and try to rewrite it into something more comfortable for you. Silence. The blonde woman had stopped pretending this wasn't happening. A couple nearby had gone very still. Daniel's jaw tightened. The charm dropped about 3 degrees. I was honest about what I needed, he said, and now his voice had an edge in it, the edge she remembered from the end of the relationship, the one that came out when he felt cornered. Not everyone is going to be attracted to stop. Damien's voice. Quiet. Absolutely quiet. But something in the quality of it changed the air pressure in their immediate vicinity. Daniel stopped. Damien took one step forward, not aggressive, not threatening in any physical sense, but deliberate. The kind of step that communicates I am choosing to move into this space, and I want you to understand that it is a choice. You're going to want to think carefully about the next sentence, Damien said. Still quiet, eyes on Daniel with the specific unblinking attention of someone who has never once backed down from anything. Daniel looked at him, and whatever he saw there, whatever calculation happened, in those 2 seconds of eye contact, the edge dropped out of his voice entirely. I wasn't, Daniel started. Let me tell you what I know about you, Damien said. He spoke with the same tone he might use to describe weather or the time or any other unremarkable fact. I know that you spent 3 years telling this woman she needed to be different in order to deserve affection. I know that you stood in a ballroom full of people you both knew, and you humiliated her publicly, and you smiled while you did it because you needed an audience for your cruelty to feel real. He paused. I know that the woman you threw away is the only remarkable thing that ever happened to you, and I know that you understand that now standing here because otherwise you wouldn't have crossed this room when you saw her. The silence was total. The couple nearby was no longer pretending to have their own conversation. Daniel's face had gone through several colors. The woman you threw away, Damien said one final time, is my wife, and I suggest you spend the rest of this evening on the other side of the room. Daniel said nothing. The blonde woman took his arm. They left. Emily stood completely still for a moment after they walked away. Then she turned to look at Damien. He was already looking at her, his expression back to its usual arrangement, composed and watchful. She wanted to say something. She wasn't sure what. Thank you felt insufficient. What you just did felt too detached. The truth was that nobody, not once in her adult life, not once in 3 years with Daniel, not once in any of the charity events, in professional situations and family gatherings where she had been quietly diminished, nobody had ever stepped into a room and said out loud in front of witnesses, the woman you threw away is the only remarkable thing that ever happened to you. She had not known until this moment how much she had needed someone to say that. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. I know, he said. You chose to. Yes, she looked at him. Why, he was quiet for a moment. Then, because nobody else was going to. It was a simple answer, the simplest possible answer. And it hit her somewhere so deep and so specific that she had to look away for a second, out at the room full of people who had no idea what had just happened in this small corner of the party, and she breathed. I need some air, she said. Okay, he said. They slipped out through a side door to a terrace. The Manhattan air was cold and sharp and real. Emily stood at the railing and breathed it in and felt very slowly the tension in her shoulders begin to release. Damien stood beside her, not speaking, not managing, just there. After a while, she said, he always made me feel like the problem was me. I know, Damien said. 3 years, she said. 3 years of being told in 100 different ways that I needed to be less of myself to deserve what he was offering. She paused. And the worst part was that I believed him. Not all at once, gradually. The way you believe something when someone says it enough times in enough different ways. Damien said nothing. He was listening. I stopped drawing, she said. I stopped spending time with people he didn't approve of. I stopped ordering what I actually wanted at restaurants. All these small surrenders that didn't feel like surrenders because each one was so small. She shook her head. And then he stood at a microphone and did it in one sentence, and somehow that was the moment I walked out. Not after 3 years, after one sentence in front of 200 people. Sometimes it takes a public moment to make private damage visible, Damien said. She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the city, not at her, and she had the sense that he wasn't saying it about her specifically, that he was saying it about something he knew from inside his own experience. The way you speak about a thing you've survived rather than observed. Isabella, she asked. He didn't answer immediately. The city moved below them, indifferent and alive. When she died, he said finally, I told myself I didn't grieve because I was strong, because that's what the situation required. Someone had to keep functioning, keep the business running, keep everything from falling apart. He paused. It took me 2 years to understand that I hadn't been strong. I had just been afraid. Afraid of what? Emily asked. He turned to look at her then, directly the way he had looked at her on the sidewalk outside the Grand Ellington Hotel on a cold September night that felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. Afraid that if I let myself feel it, he said, I wouldn't be able to stop. Emily held his gaze. She would have liked tonight, Damien said. He looked back at the city. What you said to him, she would have found it very satisfying. Emily felt something move in her chest, warm and complicated, the feeling of being seen by someone who was not trying to use what they saw. She sounds like she was fierce, humiliated. Relentlessly, Damien said, and for the first time, not an almost smile, not a half-second micro-movement, but actually, genuinely, he smiled. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. Emily turned back to the city. They stood there together in the cold for a long time, not talking, not performing anything for anyone. Just two people standing at a railing above Manhattan, each of them carrying the specific weight of what they had survived to get to this particular terrace on this particular night. When they finally went back inside, Emily walked differently than she had walked in. She didn't know if anyone else would notice. She noticed. Something had settled. Something that had been held tight and defended and armored for a long time had loosened slightly, and the loosening felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. Across the room, Daniel Hayes stood near the bar. She saw him glance at her once. She did not look away. She did not adjust her expression or her posture or anything about herself. She simply looked back at him with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone in this room. He looked away first. Emily picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and turned back toward the room and thought about Isabella Moretti, who had looked at a stranger across a crowded room and written 4 words on the back of a photograph. She thought about what Isabella had seen. She thought about what it meant that a woman she had never met had recognized something in her worth recognizing. She thought about the fact that she was still here, still standing, still herself, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. They flew back from Manhattan on a Sunday morning, and something between them had shifted in a way that neither of them named directly, but both of them felt. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was the kind of shift that happens when two people have stood together on a cold terrace and said true things to each other, and then had to figure out what to do with the morning after that. Emily sat across from Damien on the plane and drank her coffee and looked out the window and felt the particular awareness of someone who understands that a line has been crossed and there is no reasonable path back to the other side of it. She wasn't sure she wanted to go back. That thought scared her more than anything else had since she'd gotten into his car on a September sidewalk. Damien worked on his phone for most of the flight, the way he always did, but twice she looked up and found him watching her instead of his screen, and both times he didn't look away immediately. He just held her gaze for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention, and then went back to his phone, and she went back to the window, and neither of them said anything about it. Rosa was waiting at the mansion when they arrived. She took one look at the two of them walking through the door, and something moved in her face, a brief, contained satisfaction. The expression of someone who has been watching a situation develop for weeks and has just received a data point that confirms what she already suspected. Emily caught it. Rosa met her eyes and looked away and said, "Lunch in an hour, welcome home." Home. Emily rolled the word around in her mind as she went upstairs to change. It still felt borrowed. Borrowed. Like a coat that fit well enough but hadn't been worn long enough to feel like hers. But it felt less borrowed than it had a month ago, and that was something. She changed out of her travel clothes and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what Damien had said on the terrace. Afraid that if I let myself feel it, I wouldn't be able to stop. She had known grief before, Not the catastrophic kind, not the kind that reorganizes your entire life around an absence, but she understood the architecture of it. The way people build walls against it, not because they're strong, but because they're afraid of what lives on the other side. She had built her own walls, smaller ones, more domestic. The wall that kept her from telling Daniel that his comments about her body made her feel worthless. The wall that kept her from calling friends when she was struggling because she didn't want to be a burden. The wall that kept her smiling in rooms where she felt completely invisible. Different materials than Damien's walls, same function. She picked up her sketchbook from the nightstand. She opened it to a blank page. She sat there for a moment, pencil in hand, and instead of letting her hand move without thinking the way she usually did, she drew something deliberate. She drew a woman standing in a ballroom, back straight, chin level, walking toward a door. She drew her without a face, just the posture, just the decision to leave. Then she closed the sketchbook and went down to lunch. Damien was already at the table. He looked up when she walked in and she sat down, and Rosa put food in front of them, and for a moment there was the old silence, the early silence, the careful stranger silence. But then Damien said, "How are you feeling?" And the question was so direct and so genuine and so entirely without an agenda that Emily almost didn't know what to do with it. "Honestly," she said, "like something has changed and I'm not sure what to do with it." He nodded, like this was a reasonable answer, like he felt it too. "Me either," he said. They ate lunch, they talked, not about anything heavy about the foundation director Emily had spoken to at the gala, about a book Emily had found in the library that turned out to be one Damien had read twice about the roses in the garden, that Rosa apparently tended every morning at 6 a.m., because Damien had asked her to keep them alive, and then had never been able to explain why, even to himself. It was the most ordinary conversation Emily had ever had in that house, and it was because of everything that surrounded it one of the most meaningful. That night, she went to the library at 9 o'clock because she couldn't sleep, and the library was the room in the house that felt most like a place a real person lived. She pulled a book from the shelf, something she had been working through slowly, a novel about a woman who rebuilds her life after losing everything, and curled into the large chair near the window and read. She heard his footsteps in the hall at 9:45. She heard them stop outside the library door. There was a pause. Then the door opened and Damien stood in it, looking at her with that specific expression she had named privately, his recalibrating expression, the one he wore when something surprised him and he was deciding in real time how to respond to it. "You're in here," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. He crossed to the other side of the room and pulled a book from the shelf. Not randomly, she noticed, not the action of someone looking for something to do, but deliberately, like he had read this book before and had been meaning to come back to it, and sat in the chair on the other side of the lamp. They read in silence for an hour. It was the most comfortable Emily had felt inside her own body in longer than she could remember. At some point, she looked up and found him watching her again over the top of his book. This time, she didn't look back at the page. She said, "Tell me something about Isabella. Something specific. Not the grief, just her." He was quiet for a moment. She thought he might deflect. He didn't. "She was terrible at directions," he said. "Catastrophically bad. She had lived in Chicago her entire life, and she still got lost going to places she had been 50 times. She refused to admit it. She would walk in 20 minutes late to everything completely confident and tell you she had taken a better route." He paused. "She was wrong every time. She never stopped believing she was right." Emily smiled. "She sounds infuriating." "She was the most infuriating person I've ever known," Damien said. And the way he said it, the warmth underneath the precision, the love that lived inside the exasperation, made Emily's chest do something complicated. "She called me every Sunday morning at exactly 8 a.m. Not 8:01, 8. She said it was the only time of the week I was guaranteed to be still long enough to have a real conversation." He looked at his book without reading it. "I haven't known what to do with Sunday mornings since she died." Emily thought about that. 8 a.m. Sunday. For 3 years, that had been an empty slot in his week. A place where a person used to be. "What did you talk about?" she asked. "Everything," and he said. She would tell me about her week, the people she'd met, the things she was reading, the arguments she'd had. She was studying social work. She wanted to work with kids in the foster system. He stopped. She had 6 months left in her program when she died. The silence after that was different from their usual silences. Fuller, heavier in a way that felt honest rather than uncomfortable. She saw something in you before I did, Damien said. Or she saw it first. I saw it because of her. Emily looked at him carefully. What did she say to you about me specifically? He met her eyes. She said there is a woman at the hospital benefit who moves through rooms like she's been taught to apologize for taking up space, and she is doing it anyway, and you should pay attention to her because people like that are rare. Emily felt the air leave her lungs slowly. She said that, word for word, Damien said. Isabella was specific when she thought something mattered. Emily looked down at the book in her lap. She was not going to cry. She was making a firm decision about that. She breathed through it, that complicated wave of feeling grief for a woman she'd never met, gratitude for a woman she'd never met, the particular piercing quality of being recognized by someone who is no longer alive to know that the recognition landed. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Her voice came out steady, mostly. She was right about you, Damien said. She usually was. They went back to their books, but the room was different now. Something had been placed in it that hadn't been there before. Not just information presence. Isabella Moretti had entered the room briefly through the specific gravity of her brother's memory, and Emily felt the weight of her in a way that was not sad exactly. More like standing in sunlight that comes through a window in winter. Warm, real, a little painful, worth it. 3 days later, on a Wednesday morning, Emily was in the kitchen when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her mother. She had been avoiding this call for 6 weeks. She had sent 3 texts. I'm okay, I'm safe. I'll explain soon, and her mother had sent approximately 47 in return, each one escalating slightly in urgency and concern, building toward this inevitable moment. She answered. Emily Marie Carter, her mother's voice. The particular frequency of a woman who has been worried for 6 weeks and is now converting that worry into controlled volume. Hi, Mom. Where are you? What is happening? Who is Damien Moretti? I had to read about my daughter's marriage in a newspaper column. Emily, a newspaper column. I know. I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. Are you safe? Yes. Are you being held somewhere against your... Mom, no, I'm in a kitchen drinking coffee. I'm fine. A pause. Her mother breathing, recalibrating. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. So Emily told her. Not everything. Not the photograph on the bookshelf, or the Sunday mornings, or the library at 9:45, or the terrace in Manhattan, or any of the things that were still too new and too interior to say out loud to someone else. But the structure of it, the Hotel Daniel, the sidewalk, the decision, the courthouse, the mansion. She told it plainly without drama, and when she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. He just stopped his car, her mother said finally. Yes. And said, marry me. Yes. And you said yes. Not immediately. I had until noon the next day. Another silence. Emily. Her mother's voice had shifted, softer now. Are you happy? Emily stood in the kitchen with her coffee going warm in her hand and thought about the question. Really thought about it. Not the easy answer, not the reassuring answer, but the honest one. I'm becoming something, she said finally. I think happy might be part of it. I'm not sure yet, but I feel real. I feel like myself, which is more than I can say for most of the last 3 years. Her mother was quiet for a moment. He treats you well. He treats me like an adult, Emily said, which turns out to be what I needed. Her mother let out a breath. I want to meet him. I know. Give me some time. Emily, 6 weeks is already... Mom, please. A pause. Fine, but I want a phone call every week, not a text, a call. Okay. And if anything at all makes you feel unsafe, I'll call you immediately, Emily said. I promise. She hung up and stood there for a moment in the kitchen, and then she heard Damien's footsteps in the hall, and he appeared in the doorway and looked at her face and said, Your mother. How did you know? You look like someone who just survived something necessary, he said. He poured himself coffee. Is she coming here? Not yet, Emily said. She wants to meet you. That's reasonable, he said. Like the prospect of meeting his wife's mother was simply an item to be scheduled. No discomfort, no resistance. Just that's reasonable. Emily watched him drink his coffee and thought about all the times Daniel had found reasons to postpone meeting her family, to cut visits short to create distance between Emily and the people who loved her. Another form of the same control she had been too close to see clearly. "She'll like you," Emily said, eventually. "I'm not particularly concerned with being liked," Damien said. "I know," Emily said. "That might actually be what makes her like you." That almost smile. Then unexpectedly, "What does she know about me?" "The version you'd find in a newspaper," Emily said honestly. "I haven't told her the details." He nodded. His jaw shifted slightly, the micro movement she'd learned to read as him processing something he wasn't going to say yet. "What?" she asked. He looked at her. "The things in those newspapers," he said carefully. "Some of them are true." "I know," she said. "You've never asked me about them." "I'm asking now," she said. "Not for details, but I need to know, are you the person who does those things because you want to, or because it's what the life requires?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Both," he said finally. "Yeah, when I was younger, both." Now he stopped, set his coffee down. "I've spent 15 years building something that functions because people are afraid of the consequences of crossing it. I can't simply decide one morning to be different without everything I've built collapsing." He paused. "But I am trying to understand what is necessary and what is not. That is the most honest answer I can give you." Emily looked at him. "The most honest answer I can give you, not a promise, not a performance of change, just honesty about the complexity of who he was and where he was in it. That's enough," she said, "for now." The look he gave her then was not the recalibrating expression and not the almost smile. It was something she hadn't seen from him before, something quieter, more exposed. Like she had offered him something he hadn't expected to be offered and hadn't quite figured out yet how to hold it. The following Sunday, Emily was up at 7:30. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. At 8 o'clock exactly, she picked up her phone and called the number she had for Damien. He picked up on the second ring. "Emily, good morning," she said. "I thought you might want someone to talk to on Sunday mornings." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a long one. She held through it. When he spoke, his voice was different than she had ever heard it. Not broken exactly, but something in it had come loose. Something that had been held very, very tightly for 3 years. "Yes," he said quietly, "I would." So she talked to him about nothing important at first, what she was reading, a thought she'd had about the rose garden, something funny Rosa had said the day before. And then he talked, haltingly at first, then less so. He told her about a Sunday morning 3 years ago when he had picked up his phone to call Isabella and then realized for the first time that he couldn't. He told her what he had done instead. He had sat in the kitchen for 2 hours and not moved and not eaten and not spoken to anyone. And when Rosa had come in and found him there, she had simply made him coffee and sat across from him and not said anything. And that had been the kindest thing anyone had done for him in the aftermath. "She's been with you a long time," Emily said. 22 years, he said. "She worked for my father before me." "Does she know everything about you?" "More than anyone alive," he said. Emily thought about Rosa's face at the door when they had come back from Manhattan. That brief contained satisfaction. "She approves of me," Emily said. "I think." "She does," Damien said. "She told me 3 days after you arrived." Emily blinked. "What did she say?" "She said that one has more backbone than you gave her credit for." "Don't waste it." He paused. "Rosa has never been subtle." Emily laughed. A real laugh, spontaneous and unguarded, the kind that happens when something catches you off guard with its accuracy. She heard him go quiet on the other end of the line in a way that she was starting to recognize the particular quality of his silence, when something moved him and he was choosing not to show it. "Damien," she said. She hadn't planned to say what she said next. It came from somewhere that had been building quietly for weeks. Some slow accumulation of library evenings and honest conversations and Sunday phone calls and burgundy dresses and 4 words written on the back of a photograph. "I think something is happening between us that we should probably stop pretending isn't." The silence was long. "Yes," he said. "I don't know what to do with it," she said honestly. "I don't entirely trust it yet. My track record with trusting what I feel about someone is, as you know, not excellent." "I'm aware," he said. She paused, choosing words are not simple. Your life is not simple. What being with you actually means long-term is not simple. No, he agreed, it is not. But I'm not running from it, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever this is, I'm not running. Another long pause. When he spoke, his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. Neither am I, he said. And I want you to understand that for me, that is not a small thing to say. I know, she said softly. I know it isn't. They stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes after that, talking about smaller things, easier things, letting the weight of what had just been said settle between them without pressing it. When they finally hung up, Emily sat at the kitchen table with the empty coffee cup and the morning light coming through the window, and she thought about what it meant to be brave enough to say a true thing to someone before you were certain of the outcome. She thought about Daniel and the microphone. She thought about 3 years of making herself smaller. She thought about the woman in the ballroom who had walked out alone while 200 people watched. She thought about what that woman had survived and where she was sitting now in a kitchen that had slowly started to feel like hers on the phone with a man who read in libraries at night and had kept his sister's roses alive because he couldn't bring himself not to. She was still that woman from the ballroom. She had not stopped being her, but she was also becoming someone else, someone who knew that she had never needed to apologize for the space she occupied, someone who understood in a way that was finally landing in her body and not just her head, that love was not something you earned by diminishing yourself. Love was something that found you when you were too tired to perform and decided to be real instead. She picked up her sketchbook. She opened it to a new page. She drew 2 chairs in a library, a lamp between them, 2 people reading. She drew them without faces again, but this time it wasn't because they were anonymous. It was because the faces didn't matter. What mattered was the posture, the particular quality of 2 people existing in the same space without pretending to be something they weren't. She drew them close together. She drew them real. And somewhere in the house, she heard his footsteps in the hall, not heading toward his study, not toward the door, but toward the kitchen, and she turned the page to a fresh one and waited for him to come in. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her sketchbook open on the table. Not intrusively, he didn't lean over to look at what she was drawing. He just registered it the way he registered most things about Emily now, with that quiet, specific attention she had stopped finding unsettling and started finding something closer to extraordinary. A man who noticed, not to criticize, not to evaluate, just to see. You draw every morning, he said. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. I used to, she said. Before. He understood what before meant. He didn't ask her to explain it. What happened to it, he asked. Emily set her pencil down. Daniel thought it was a distraction, not productive, not serious. He never said stop exactly. He just had a way of making me feel slightly embarrassed about anything that was only for me. She paused. So I stopped. Gradually. The way you stop doing most things that someone makes you feel small about. Damien was quiet for a moment. How long? Almost 2 years, she said. His jaw moved slightly. That micro movement she'd learned to read as contained anger, not at her, never at her, but at the shape of what had been done. 2 years is a long time to stop being yourself, he said. Yes, she said, it is. He looked at the sketchbook. Can I see it? She turned it toward him. He looked at the drawing she had just made, 2 chairs, a lamp, 2 people reading, close together and real. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he turned the pages back slowly, looking at the earlier drawings. The woman walking toward a door. The roses from the garden. Several pages of hands. A drawing of Rosa's face from memory that had turned out better than Emily expected. A drawing of the view from her bedroom window that was technically a landscape, but was really about the quality of light on a specific morning when she had felt for the first time that the word home might eventually stop feeling borrowed. He turned to the drawing of the 2 chairs and looked at it again. This is us, he said, not a question. Yes, she said. He turned the sketchbook back toward her. He didn't say anything about the drawings themselves, no critique, no interpretation, no performance of appreciation. He just nodded once the way he nodded when something confirmed something he had already understood. Keep drawing, he said. I intend to, she said. 3 days later on a Wednesday evening, everything almost fell apart. Emily was in the library at 8 o'clock when she heard voices in the hallway outside. Not Rose's voice, not Damien's. Multiple voices, men speaking in low, rapid tones that communicated urgency without volume. She heard Damien's voice cut through them, short-clipped, commanding. Then footsteps moving fast toward the front of the house. She stayed where she was. She had learned in the weeks since Manhattan that there were parts of Damien's world that moved around her without including her, and that the correct response when those parts moved was not to insert herself into them. Not out of fear, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what she had married and what she hadn't married. She had married the man. She had not married the business, the operations, the infrastructure of controlled danger that kept his world functioning. But she also was not going to pretend she felt nothing when she heard that particular tone in his voice. She sat in the library and read 3 pages of her book without absorbing any of them. At 9:15, the voices stopped. At 9:30, the front door closed. At 9:47, Damien appeared in the library doorway. He looked tired. Not physically, he was too controlled for exhaustion to show in his posture, but in his eyes. Behind the precision, behind the armor, there was something that had been pressed hard for the last hour and was holding but not easily. "Is everyone okay?" Emily asked. She said it directly. She had stopped softening her questions. "Yes," he said. He crossed the room and sat in his chair. The one across from hers, the one that had become without either of them saying so. His chair in this room, and leaned his head back for a moment and closed his eyes. She watched him. She didn't say anything. After a moment, he said without opening his eyes, "Someone I trusted made a decision that put 3 people in danger. I found out in time. It's handled." He paused. "But I have been doing this for 15 years, and I still manage to be surprised when people I trust choose poorly." "That's not a flaw," Emily said. "That's just what happens when you let yourself trust someone." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "You make it sound straightforward." "It isn't," she said. "Trusting people is a risk every time. The alternative is not trusting anyone, and you know where that leads." She looked at him steadily. "You've been living there for 3 years. He held her gaze. Something moved in his face, that flash of raw and unguarded that came less rarely now that she had stopped bracing for because she had started to understand it as a gift rather than a warning. He was letting her see something, choosing to. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Whatever this is, between us, I don't have a template for it." "Neither do I," she said. "My template was apparently designed by someone who thought love was a performance review." Something crossed his face, almost a smile, then past it, an actual one, small and real, lasting 3 full seconds before it settled back into his usual arrangement. "I need you to know something," he said. He sat forward in the chair, elbows on knees, hands together, the posture of a man who has decided to say a thing he has been carrying for a while and is now going to put it down. "When I stopped you on the sidewalk that night, it was not impulsive. I had been watching you for 6 months the way Isabella asked me to, and I had been telling myself it was about her. That I was paying attention to you because she had asked me to, because it was something I could do for her after she was gone." Emily held very still. "But that night," he said, "when I saw you walk out of that hotel alone in that dress with your back straight and your chin level and sit down on that concrete," he stopped, started again. "I understood something. The reason I had been watching you for 6 months had nothing to do with Isabella and everything to do with the fact that you were the first person I had seen in 3 years who reminded me that dignity was a choice, not a position, not a bank account, not who was afraid of you." He looked at her. "A choice. You made it on a sidewalk in front of nobody. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen." Emily pressed both hands flat against her knees. She was not going to cry. She was not going to let the full weight of what he had just said land all at once, because if it did, she was going to be completely useless for the rest of the conversation, and there were things she needed to say too. "Damien," she said. Her voice came out steady. "I need to tell you something too." He waited. "I came with you that morning because I had nothing left to lose," she said. "That's the honest version. I was humiliated and exhausted, and the alternative was going back to a life that had been making me smaller for 3 years. I chose you because any door felt better than the one I just walked out of." She paused, but somewhere between the courthouse and the library and the Sunday phone calls and Manhattan, something happened that has nothing to do with having nowhere else to go. "Tell me," he said. I am here because I want to be here, she said. Not because I'm afraid of going back. Not because this is better than the alternative. Because you specifically, you as a person, you and your terrible Sunday mornings, and your sister's roses, and the way you said my wife in Manhattan without any hesitation, you are someone I want to be near. She took a breath. That is terrifying for me to say. I want you to know that. Choosing someone deliberately after everything is the hardest thing I have done in this entire situation. He was quiet for a long moment. Then we're both terrified, he said. Good, she said. That means we're both taking it seriously. That night, Emily lay awake for a long time, not from anxiety, but from the particular aliveness that comes after saying a true thing to someone who actually heard it. The ceiling above her bed was the same ceiling it had always been. The room was the same room, but something in the quality of the air had changed the way air changes after a window is open in a room that has been closed too long. She thought about what Damien had said. Dignity is a choice. She thought about whether she had ever understood that about herself before he said it. She thought about the years she had spent trying to earn other people's assessments of her worth, trying to fit into smaller and smaller versions of herself, as if shrinking was a form of generosity. She thought about Daniel's voice in the microphone and the 200 faces and the white dress and the sidewalk. And then she let herself think. The thought she had been careful not to think too directly. What if none of that was actually about her? What if Daniel's cruelty had been entirely about Daniel, his fear, his smallness, his need for an audience? What if she had been trying to fix a problem that had never belonged to her? She was 34 years old. She had spent 11 years of her adult life in relationships with people who made her feel like a problem to be solved. She had spent those 11 years trying to be the solution. She was done with that. The realization didn't come in a flash. It settled. Quietly, completely the way truth settles when you finally stop arguing with it. She was done. The next morning, she woke up before her alarm and went downstairs and made breakfast for both of them. Not because it was her role, not because she had been asked, but because she wanted to. Because she had woken up in a house that was starting to feel like hers, and she wanted to inhabit it fully rather than move through it carefully the way a guest moves through a space that doesn't belong to them. Damien came into the kitchen at 7 and stopped in the doorway when he saw her at the stove. "You're cooking," he said. "Observant," she said. He sat down at the table. He watched her move around the kitchen with the particular attention he gave things he found genuinely interesting. She put food in front of him and sat across from him, and he looked at the plate and then at her. "You seem different this morning," he said. "I made a decision last night," she said. "About what?" "About being done apologizing," she said. "For my body, for my needs, for taking up space, for wanting things. I've been done for a while, I think. But last night it became final, like a door closing." He looked at her steadily. "What does that feel like?" She thought about it honestly. "Like putting down something heavy that I carried for so long, I forgot it wasn't part of me," she said. He nodded, once, the way he nodded when something mattered. They ate breakfast. Outside the window, February was moving toward March in the slow, reluctant way of Chicago winters, and the roses in the garden were still bare but not dead, waiting the particular stubbornness of living things that have been through hard seasons before. 2 weeks later, Emily's mother came to the mansion. Her name was Carol Carter, and she was 61 years old and 5'3", and had never once in her life walked into a room without immediately assessing every person in it. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon with a rolling suitcase and a casserole dish covered in foil, in the particular expression of a woman who has prepared extensively for a difficult conversation and intends to have it. Emily met her at the door. They held each other for a long moment, the way mothers and daughters hold each other when too much time has passed and too much has happened without being discussed. Carol pulled back and looked at Emily's face with the rapid, total attention of someone who knows this face better than their own. "You look different," Carol said. "I feel different," Emily said. "Good different?" Or "Good," Emily said firmly. "Come in." Damien met them in this hallway. He was in his usual dark clothing, his usual composed posture, his usual expression that gave nothing away immediately. Carol stopped in front of him and looked up at him. She had to look up considerably, and then she did something Emily had not predicted. She held out her hand and said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Moretti. I spent 6 weeks being very afraid for my daughter. I need you to look me in the eye and tell me she is safe." Damien shook her hand. He looked her in the eye. She is, he said, and she has told me that if that changes, she will call you immediately. Carol assessed him for 3 full seconds. She has backbone, Carol said. I raised her with backbone. I need the person she's with to know what that means. I know exactly what it means, Damien said. It is why she is here. Carol looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Emily. Then she handed Damien the casserole dish. Put this somewhere warm, she said. I'm staying for dinner. That dinner was the strangest and most genuine meal Emily had ever sat through. Carol asked Damien questions with the directness of someone who has decided that politeness is a luxury for situations that aren't this one. He answered every question honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was complicated. He didn't perform charm. He didn't soften things or manage her reaction or tell her what she wanted to hear. When she asked about his business, he said, I operate in spaces that are not always legal, and I have made choices I cannot fully defend. What I can tell you is that your daughter is not part of any of that and never will be. Carol was quiet for a moment. That's more honest than I expected, she said. Your daughter values honesty, he said. I've noticed that honesty in this family appears to be structural. Carol looked at Emily. Emily looked back at her. Something passed between them, recognition, relief, the particular warmth of a mother who has spent 6 weeks worrying and has just received enough information to change the frequency of that worry from acute to manageable. He'll do, Carol said finally. To Emily, not to Damien. Mom, Emily said. I'm not talking to you, Carol said. I'm talking to myself. He'll do. Damien, to his credit, did not react to being evaluated like a piece of furniture. Or possibly Emily thought he found it privately amusing. It was difficult to tell. After dinner, Carol pulled Emily aside in the kitchen while Damien made coffee. Tell me the truth, Carol said, quiet and direct. Are you genuinely okay? Yes, Emily said. And then because her mother deserved the full version, I am better than okay, Mom. I know that it sounds impossible given how this started. I know from the outside it looks like I made an impulsive decision in the middle of the worst night of my life. And maybe I did. But the person I am right now in this house, living this life, this is more myself than I have been in years. I'm drawing again. I'm saying what I actually think. I'm taking up space without apologizing for it. She looked at her mother steadily. He sees me, not who he wants me to be, not a smaller, more convenient version. He sees me exactly as I am, and he married me anyway, and not once has he made me feel like that was a compromise. Carol looked at her for a long time. Your father saw me that way, she said finally, exactly that way. She reached up and touched Emily's face briefly, the gesture of a mother who knows her child is no longer a child and is proud of it and sad about it in equal measure. Good, she said, good. She left Sunday afternoon. At the door, she shook Damien's hand again and said, Sunday mornings. I call Emily every Sunday morning. You should know that. 8 o'clock, Damien said. Carol looked at him. 8:15. I'm not unreasonable. He almost smiled. Emily saw it. Carol, she was fairly certain, saw it too. The last Sunday of February, Emily was in the rose garden when Damien found her there. She was standing near the roses, not doing anything in particular, just being near them in the cold morning air, the way she had been doing once or twice a week since she understood why he kept them alive. Damien came out through the glass door and stood beside her without being asked. Rosa says they'll start coming in March, she said, if the winter doesn't stay too long. It usually doesn't, he said. Isabella used to say Chicago winters feel permanent, but they always lie. Emily smiled. She was right. They stood side by side. The air was cold. Neither of them moved to go back inside. I need to tell you something, Damien said. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at the roses. He was looking at her. Directly, with an openness in his face that she had only seen in fragments before the flash of the unguarded, the almost smile, the moments when the wall came down briefly and then went back up. The wall was not back up. She could see it clearly that it was down, not collapsed. He was not a man whose walls collapsed, but chosen. He had chosen to lower it. I am in love with you, he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, with precision, without decoration, with the specific authority of someone who does not say things he doesn't mean. I have been trying not to say it because I am genuinely afraid of what it means to love someone again after Isabella. I am afraid of what happens to me if I lose someone again. I understand that that fear is not your responsibility, and I am not telling you this to put it on you. I am telling you because you deserve to know the truth of where I am, and because I think you already know it, and because Isabella would have told me to stop being a coward about it approximately 3 months ago. Emily held very still, not from shock, not from fear, from the fullness of it, the specific, complete fullness of a moment she had not let herself believe was actually coming. "Damien," she said, "you don't have to," he started. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "I have been for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." Something happened in his face then that she had never seen before and would never forget. It wasn't the almost smile or the full second smile. It was something that started in his eyes before it reached anywhere else. Something that had been locked behind 3 years of grief and 15 years of armor, and the particular weight of being a man who had decided that feeling things was a liability he couldn't afford. It broke the surface. Just for a moment, just enough. He took her face in both hands, carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered. He kissed her, not impulsively, not like a man who has been holding back and finally let go, like a promise, like someone who has thought about what they're doing and has decided it fully and is now doing it with everything they have. Emily kissed him back. There in the rose garden on the last Sunday of February, in the cold morning air of a Chicago winter that Isabella had promised always lies about being permanent, with the bare roses holding on around them, like they had been holding on for exactly this reason. When they stepped back from each other, his hands were still holding her face. She put both of hers over his. "She would be furious it took us this long," Emily said. "She would have been insufferable about it," Damien said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way she had never heard before. "She would have said I told you so for approximately 6 months." "I would have liked her," Emily said. "Almost at him." "I know," he said. She knew it too. Emily thought about 4 words written on the back of a photograph by a woman with dark eyes and a terrible sense of direction and a Sunday morning phone call habit that had outlived her. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who was no longer alive to know they had been right. She thought about the particular grace of that, of being recognized across a crowded room by someone whose recognition had been the seed of everything that followed. She has the eyes. Yes, Isabella, she had the eyes. The eyes of someone who had survived things and hadn't let it make her hard. The eyes of someone who had walked out of a ballroom and in a white dress with her chin level and her back straight, and who had kept walking through a courthouse, in a cold mansion, in a terrace in Manhattan, in a library at 9:45, in a rose garden in February, all the way to this. She had never needed to be smaller. She had never needed to shrink, apologize, diminish, or disappear. The love worth having, the real kind, the kind built from honesty and grief and shared libraries and Sunday mornings, had not asked her to be less. It had found her by being an exactly, fully, unapologetically herself. That was the truth no one had told her. You do not earn real love by making yourself easier to love. You find it by refusing to make yourself anything other than real. Emily Carter had been real on a sidewalk in a white dress when nobody came to stand beside her. And the most feared man in Chicago had looked at her and known exactly what he was seeing. The roses would come in March. The winter always lied. And in the space between what was lost and what was possible, 2 people who had both learned the hard way that walls do not protect you from grief, they only protect you from living, had chosen deliberately and with full knowledge of the risk to open the door. That choice was not the end of anything. It was the only beginning that had ever been worth making.